The Pentagon just handed Lockheed Martin $300 billion over 5 years. One company, $300 billion. That's more than most countries produce in an entire year. And if you ask the average person where that money went, they'll say fighter jets, aircraft carriers, missiles. They're not wrong, but they're not right either. Because here's what almost nobody understands about defense spending. The companies building the weapons aren't the ones making the most money. The real winners are buried 3 layers deep in a supply chain most people have never heard of. Companies with names you can't pronounce, making parts you've never seen, earning margins that would make a tech startup jealous. A $100 million contract flows from the Pentagon to a prime contractor. By the time it reaches the factory floor where the actual work happens, only $30 million is left. The other $70 million? It vanished into a web of subcontractors, markups, and overhead charges that make a New York City real estate deal look transparent. This isn't corruption. It's not even illegal. It's just how the system works. Here's the question nobody in Washington wants you to ask. If we're spending over $1 trillion a year on national defense, why does it take so long to build anything? Why are we always running out of ammunition? Why does a single fighter jet cost more than some countries spend on their entire military? The answer isn't in the Pentagon budget documents. It's not in the congressional hearing testimony. It's in the money flow, dollar by dollar, contract by contract, from the moment Congress approves the National Defense Authorization Act to the moment a wrench actually touches metal in a factory somewhere. And what you find when you follow the money is that it is a system so deliberately complex that even the people running it don't fully understand where it all goes. A system where inefficiency isn't a bug, it's a feature. Because the more layers you add, the more companies get a cut. And the more companies getting a cut, the more congressional districts have jobs depending on defense spending. Which means more votes to keep the whole machine running. To understand how this works, we need to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of this budget year, the beginning of the entire modern defense industrial system. 1958. President Eisenhower is in his second term. The Cold War is heating up. The Soviet Union just launched Sputnik, and suddenly America realizes it's in a technology race it might actually lose. The Pentagon's response is to consolidate. Before World War II, the U.S. had dozens of aircraft manufacturers, hundreds of shipyards, thousands of small suppliers all competing. By the 1960s, that number is shrinking fast. Lockheed, Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, Grumman, Northrop. The big names start emerging. But the Pentagon doesn't just want planes and ships. It wants systems. Integrated weapons platforms where everything talks to everything else. Radar, communications, fire control, engines, avionics, all working together. No single company can build all of it. So they start doing something new. Prime contractors. Here's how it works. The Pentagon awards a contract to one company, the prime. Let's say Lockheed wins the contract to build a fighter jet. Lockheed doesn't actually build the whole thing. They build maybe 15 to 20% of it. The rest gets subcontracted out. Pratt and Whitney make the engine. Northrop Grumman builds the radar. BAE Systems handles electronic warfare. Hundreds of smaller companies make everything from fasteners to fuel pumps. And every single one of those companies adds a margin. You got their cost plus their profit. By the time you add up all the layers, a jet that costs $30 million in actual parts, and labor ends up costing $80 million by the time the Pentagon writes the check. This isn't a conspiracy. It's just math. Layer after layer of companies, each taking their cut. Fast forward to today. The defense budget just hit a record. Over $1 trillion when you include all military-related spending. Not $800 billion. Over $1 trillion, thanks to supplemental funding Congress approved in the latest National Defense Authorization Act. About 54% of that money, roughly $540 billion, goes to private contractors, not to soldiers' salaries, not to veterans' benefits, to companies building weapons, systems, and services. And here's where it gets interesting. From 2020 to 2024, the last 5 years where we have complete data, just 5 companies received $771 billion in contracts. 5 companies out of that entire $500 billion annual contractor pie. Lockheed Martin leads with $313 billion over 5 years. RTX, formerly Raytheon, got $145 billion. Boeing, $115 billion despite all their recent problems. General Dynamics, $116 billion. Northrop Grumman, $81 billion. Those 5 companies captured 1/3 of all Pentagon contract spending over those 5 years. 1/3 goes to 5 firms. That's concentration. But here's what most people miss. Those big numbers, they're not actually the profit. They're revenue, the amount the Pentagon paid out. To understand who's really making money, you need to look at margins. And that's where the story gets much more interesting. Let's break down what happens to that money. Use Lockheed Martin as the example because they're the biggest. In 2024, Lockheed reported about $71 billion in revenue. 93% of that came from government contracts, 74% directly from the US government, the rest from foreign military sales and allies. They are, for all practical purposes, a government-funded enterprise. Their operating margins vary by division. The Missiles and Fire Control Division, which makes things like Javelin missiles and THAAD interceptors, runs at about 13% operating margin. That's actually pretty good for a prime contractor. Most defense primes operate in the 8 to 12% range. But here's the thing. Lockheed isn't keeping all $71 billion. They're prime contractors on programs like the F-35, the most expensive weapon system in history. A single F-35 costs about $80 million, give or take, depending on the variant. But Lockheed only keeps about $12 million of that for final assembly and integration. The other $68 million flows out to subcontractors. Pratt & Whitney gets roughly $25 million for the engine. Northrop Grumman gets $18 million for the radar system. BAE Systems gets $8 million for electronic warfare. L3Harris Technologies captures another significant portion for communications and mission systems. And it cascades from there. Those subcontractors aren't making everything either. They're buying components from Tier 3 suppliers who are buying materials from Tier 4 suppliers. Each layer adds cost. So when people say defense contractors are getting rich off taxpayers, they're not wrong. They're just looking at the wrong contractors. Let me show you what I mean. There's a company called Mercury Systems. Heard of them? Most people haven't. They make secure processing modules for defense applications, things like radar processing, electronic warfare systems, signals intelligence, basically the computers that go inside military platforms. Mercury's revenue in 2024 was about $988 million. Less than $1 billion. Lockheed makes that in about 5 days. But here's the difference. Mercury's operating margins on certain product lines run between 25 and 35%. 3 times what Lockheed makes. Why? Because Mercury makes components that are sole source or near sole source for specific programs. If you're building a certain type of radar system or electronic warfare pod, there might be only 2 or 3 companies in the world that make the processing module you need, and Mercury is often one of them. That gives them pricing power. They're not bidding against 20 other companies on cost. They're bidding on whether their technology meets the spec, and once they're designed into a platform, replacing them is expensive and time-consuming. So they keep getting the business year after year at healthy margins. There's another company, Curtiss-Wright. They make flight control actuation systems, data recorders, naval propulsion components. If you've been on a Navy aircraft carrier or submarine, you've been surrounded by Curtiss-Wright equipment. They've been doing this since 1952. They have institutional knowledge and relationships that would take decades for a competitor to replicate. Their defense business runs at margins in the mid-20% range. Again, double what the primes make. Because they're not assembling complex systems with thousands of parts. They're making specific critical components that the primes depend on. Then there's Ducommun, structural components for missiles, electronic assemblies, specialty fasteners. They're what's called a Tier 2 supplier. They sell to the primes, who integrate their parts into larger systems. Ducommun's margins on defense work sit in the 30 to 35% range on certain contracts. You see the pattern? The further down the supply chain you go, away from the big visible names everyone knows, the higher the margins get. Because at the lower tiers, you're not dealing with massive programs with intense congressional oversight and competitive bidding. You're dealing with specialty components, often sole source, where the barrier to entry is technical expertise and ITAR clearances. Not price. ITAR, the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, creates massive barriers for new companies trying to enter this space. Getting the security clearances, meeting the regulatory requirements, can take years before a company can even bid on classified contracts. This regulatory moat protects existing suppliers and makes their positions nearly unassailable. Now here's where this gets truly wild. Congress just passed something in the 2025 National Defense Authorization Act that almost nobody outside the industry noticed. A pilot program allowing defense contractors to get reimbursed for the interest they pay on debt. Read that again. The government is going to pay companies back for their borrowing costs. Lockheed Martin reported $17.8 billion in outstanding interest-bearing debt last year. If this pilot program gets fully implemented, taxpayers could end up covering a significant portion of those interest payments. For all 5 of the major primes, we're talking potentially billions of dollars in what amounts to free money. The Pentagon itself warned against this 2 years ago. Their own analysis said it would create a moral hazard. Companies would have an incentive to borrow more because the government would cover the interest cost. It would increase revenue and profit without actually producing anything additional, and yet it's in the budget, buried in the fine print of a pilot program with no hard spending cap. You want to know why defense stocks keep going up? This is why. The system isn't just designed to funnel money to contractors, it's designed to remove risk from contractors. Cost plus contracts that guarantee profit regardless of performance. Programs that run for decades, providing stable revenue streams. And now potentially interest payment reimbursements that make debt essentially free. Well, let's zoom out for a second and look at what all this creates. Geographic concentration. A Virginia-class submarine, depending on the configuration, costs between $3.7 and $6.2 billion. Only 2 companies in America can build them: General Dynamics, Electric Boat in Connecticut, and Huntington Ingalls. Industries: Newport News, shipbuilding in Virginia. That's it. 2 yards, 2 congressional districts, 2 sets of senators and representatives whose political survival depends on submarine contracts continuing to flow. The F-35 program involves suppliers in all 50 states and multiple countries. That wasn't an accident. Lockheed deliberately designed the supply chain to maximize political support. When a program touches every state, it becomes nearly impossible to cancel. Because canceling it means killing jobs in 50 congressional districts simultaneously. This is why defense programs almost never get terminated, even when they're behind schedule and over budget. The political cost of cancellation exceeds the financial cost of continuation. So programs limp along, burning through billions. Because stopping them would anger too many constituents. The money flow determines the politics, and the politics determines which programs get funded. It's a closed loop, and everyone inside the loop benefits. The primes get their contracts, the subcontractors get their purchase orders, the local economies get jobs, the politicians get reelected. The only people not directly benefiting are the taxpayers funding it all. And they don't understand the system well enough to demand changes. Here's the modern reality. We are heading into what defense analysts call a new arms race. China is building ships faster than the US. Russia is reconstituting its military after Ukraine. Iran, North Korea, all of them are investing heavily in military capabilities, which means, regardless of your politics, defense spending is going up. The question isn't whether we spend more, it's where that additional money flows. And if current trends hold, it's going to flow through the exact same channels, the same 5 primes, the same constellation of subcontractors, the same congressional districts, with the same inefficiencies baked in. There's a push for reform. Some members of Congress want more competition, more small companies, faster procurement timelines. The Pentagon talks about this constantly. Innovative contracting, commercial technology adoption, streamlined acquisition. But here's the problem. The system resists change because the system is designed to resist change. If you're a new company trying to break into defense, you face years of qualifying for security clearances, meeting ITAR requirements, getting through the Pentagon's bureaucratic procurement process. And even if you succeed, you're competing against incumbents who have decades-long relationships with program managers and intimate knowledge of how to navigate the system. The barriers to entry aren't just technical, they're institutional, cultural, political. So where does this leave investors? Because that's the other side of this story. If you understand the money flow, you understand which companies are positioned to win. The conventional wisdom says buy the primes: Lockheed, RTX, Boeing, Northrop, General Dynamics. And that's not wrong. They have massive backlogs, stable revenue, political protection. They're as close to guaranteed income as you can get in the stock market. But they're also huge, slow-moving companies with relatively thin margins and intense oversight. Their stock prices reflect that. They're priced for stability, not explosive growth. Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers offer the greatest growth potential. The companies make the components that go into multiple platforms. The ones with sole source positions or near monopolies on specific technologies. Mercury Systems, Curtiss-Wright, Ducommun, Kess, Kratos Defense. Companies most retail investors have never heard of, but that defense industry insiders know are critical. These firms typically have higher margins, less political visibility, and more pricing power. They're also more volatile. A single program cancellation can hit them harder than it would hit a massive prime with dozens of programs. But if you believe defense spending is heading up for the next decade, which most analysts do, these are the companies that capture disproportionate benefits. There's also a wave of new tech companies entering the space: Palantir, Anduril, SpaceX. These firms are bringing commercial tech speed to defense applications, software, AI, autonomous systems, space infrastructure. The Pentagon is actively trying to work with them because the traditional primes move too slowly on emerging technology. What's particularly interesting is these companies are forming consortiums to compete directly with the primes. Anduril, Palantir, SpaceX, and others recently formed a partnership to bid on major Pentagon contracts, including the Golden Dome missile defense competition. They're trying to bypass the traditional prime contractor model entirely. But here's the challenge for these new entrants. They're fast and innovative, but they don't have institutional relationships or an understanding of how defense procurement actually works. They're used to commercial markets where you can iterate quickly and fail fast. Defense doesn't work that way. Programs take years to approve. Failures become congressional investigations. The pace is glacial compared to Silicon Valley. So, the smart play for these tech companies is often to partner with the primes rather than replace them entirely. Be the innovative engine while the prime handles the bureaucratic navigation. We're starting to see this happen more frequently. Palantir works with everyone. Anduril is partnering on specific programs. SpaceX has become the de facto launch provider for national security space missions. The future of defense spending isn't primes versus new tech. It's primes integrated with new tech. And the companies that figure that partnership model out are the ones that win. Let's come back to the core reality. The Pentagon's budget is over $1 trillion. That number is going up, not down. Roughly half of it flows to private companies. And the structure of how it flows, the layers of contractors and subcontractors and markups, that structure is remarkably stable. It's changed very little in the past 50 years, despite multiple reform efforts. Why? Because it's not designed for efficiency. It's designed for political durability. Every inefficiency serves a purpose. Every extra layer creates jobs in another congressional district. Every delayed program means more years of contract revenue. And once you understand that, you understand why the system works the way it does. This isn't an accident. It's the result of decades of decisions, each one logical in its own context, that created a machine designed to spend money in politically sustainable ways. The people making the most profit from this aren't the ones you'd expect. They're not the big names on the news. Small and mid-sized companies manufacture unseen components. The ones with the pricing power, the ones with institutional knowledge, the ones that are designed into platforms and can't be easily replaced. That's where the real margins hide. Not in the final assembly of a fighter jet, in the secure processing module that goes into the radar, in the actuator that controls the flight surfaces, in the specialized fastener that holds critical components together under stress. Boring, invisible, and extraordinarily profitable. This wasn't just a budget. This was the architecture of how American military power gets built, sustained, and funded. And once you see how the money actually flows, once you understand which companies touch it at which stages, you realize the defense industry isn't really about defending anything. It's about money flows, political relationships, geographic distribution of jobs, and a system so complex that the complexity itself becomes the product. We still live inside this system today. Every weapons program, every procurement decision, every debate over the defense budget, it all runs through these same channels, the same contractors, the same congressional dynamics. And the next time someone tells you we need to increase defense spending or cut defense spending or reform defense acquisition, you'll know what they're really talking about. They're talking about redirecting one of the largest sustained transfers of taxpayer money to private industry in human history. The question isn't whether it happens, it's who gets the money. If understanding how the Pentagon's trillion-dollar budget actually flows through the defense industry is useful to you, if seeing the invisible architecture of military spending matters, then this is the kind of analysis we produce every week. War, finance, and the hidden systems that connect them. Hit subscribe, like, and share the video, because this isn't just about defense contractors. It's about how power and money actually works. Click the next video for another deep analysis. Thanks for watching.